Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia with the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. And just because I think there may be a few people here that perhaps have not been to the Wilson Center before, I'll just give a very brief take on the Wilson Center. What are we? We're chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We serve as the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue in order to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. And our aim is to build a bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy. All of this is done in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson, the only U.S. president to have held a PhD, which I'm sure everyone knew. And I should say as well that just the other day, the Wilson Center celebrated its 50th birthday. We've now been around for 5 decades, so we're now well into middle age, but we're still going strong. So today we will be having a discussion about Islam, Islamic thought, Islamic law, the issue of Islamization, mainly but not exclusively as it applies in Pakistan. And this is a very important discussion to be having. Here in Washington, when it comes to the question of Pakistan, there really are not that many deep dives on these issues and how it all fits into the modern nation state and politics. And many that study Pakistan certainly know about the very complicated history between religion and state. We all know that when Zia-ul-Haq undertook that Islamization program, it was a really big deal that had major implications for so much in Pakistan, including up to the present day. But we really don't go deeper than that, and we should. So we were very fortunate today to have been able to partner with the Religious Freedom Institute, an organization that we've collaborated with on the past as well, to host this fascinating discussion. We have a terrific group of panelists with some extremely knowledgeable and distinguished and authoritative figures on the issues that we're going to be discussing today. So you should have the bios in front of you, so I won't go over all of them in detail. I'll be very brief. We have first Ismail Royer, who is a research and program associate at the Religious Freedom Institute. He has a very interesting background, as you'll see on his bio. He's studied religious sciences with traditional Islamic scholars, spent over a decade working at nonprofit Islamic organizations, and some years ago he was indicted for assisting Lashkar-e-Taiba. He pled guilty to weapons charges related to the violation of U.S. neutrality laws, but since his release, he's worked to promote peace between faiths and to undermine religious extremism. Sohaib Khan is a doctoral candidate at Columbia University. He also has a master's from Duke University and a bachelor's from the prestigious LUMS in Pakistan. He's a student of Islamic legal theory. He studied under scholars of the Hanafi legal tradition in Pakistan and also Jordan. Our next speaker is on his way, as we understand it. Dr. Abdullah Hamid Ali is a senior faculty member of Zaytuna College in Berkeley, specializing in Islamic law, and he holds degrees from universities in Morocco and also from the graduate. He holds a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union. And then finally, we have with us Sheikh Mohammed Amin Kolwadia, who is an Islamic judge and a legal scholar. He's regarded as an expert theologian and philosopher. He's a graduate of the very renowned Dar-ul-Alam Madrasa in India, and he's also studied at the Jamaat-ul-Alam al-Islamiyya Madrasa in Karachi. And he is also the founder of Darul Qasim, which is an Institute of Traditional Islamic Learning in Chicago. So it's a great group of panelists we're going to have with us this morning. Again, I wanted to thank the Religious Freedom Institute, and particularly Ismail, but also his colleague Jeremy Barker, who I believe is here in the room somewhere, for partnering with us on this great event. Also want to thank our in-house partner, the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, for its co-sponsorship of this event. So we will hear brief remarks from our speakers consecutively, and then we'll go to a discussion. So I think we're going to be starting with you, Ismail. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So, what I'm going to be talking about is the specific case of the blasphemy law in Pakistan, Section 295C of Chapter 15 of the Pakistani Penal Code, and how this illustrates the problems and difficulties that come about when trying to introduce Sharia or Islamic law principles into the nation state or into the context of modernity. So if we look back at the Pakistani Penal Code itself, it was inherited, as most people know, from the Indian Penal Code, which was written by the colonial British it was specifically written for the express purpose of replacing Islamic law and Hindu law in the Indian subcontinent. And this penal code contained within it a chapter dealing with insults to people's religion. And they made it a crime to insult other people's religion, for anyone to insult anyone's religion. And the commission that drafted it, and specifically Lord Macaulay, who was the author of it, said that the purpose of that was to enforce toleration, the principles of toleration. So it's very interesting and ironic that a law that was intended to enforce toleration wound up eventually being a driver of intolerance and communal strife. It was in the interest of the British at the time to maintain order in its colony, and so that was actually the express purpose of that law. So when Pakistan was created, it inherited the Indian Penal Code, and as did India itself and Bangladesh. So all three of these nations have a Section 295 and a Chapter 15 dealing with insulting people's religion. In 1986, Zia al-Haq, as part of his Islamization program, introduced several new sections, amendments to Section 295, including 295C, which criminalizes insulting the Prophet Muhammad. And this law was introduced to Parliament by Zia al-Haq as an amendment, and the Parliament debated it and passed it. And this law had two penalties to it, either a life sentence or death. These were the only two possible punishments that a judge could hand down for a conviction under the statute. And then in 1990, someone by the name of Ismail Qureshi introduced a petition, filed a petition with the Federal Sharia Court in Pakistan. The Federal Sharia Court is a court that is empowered with judging whether laws of the Pakistani that are passed by the Pakistani Parliament are in accord with the Sharia or not, with Islamic law or not, and they are empowered to vacate laws that to strike laws that do not, in its judgment, accord with the Sharia. So this petition was brought to argue that a life sentence was not permissible under Islamic law. The petition argued that only death was permissible under the Sharia for insulting the Prophet. And the court ruled that, in fact, the petitioner was correct. And the petition cited and the court cited several different fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence texts to find that, in fact, death was the only possible sentence for this. And so, therefore, after that, anyone who is charged and convicted under this statute must be sentenced to a mandatory death sentence. And so that's where the law stands now. And as a result of this law, now about 50% of those who have been charged under this law have been Christians, who make up about 4% of the population of Pakistan. And there are a number of, I'm introducing this as an example of the problem of attempts to bring Sharia into modernity, because this law and its application actually contradict the Sharia in many ways, Islamic law in many ways, in ways that I think are inevitable due to the fact of its introduction into the context of a modern nation state. So not only is this law violating the principles of what outsiders would look and say this is not a liberal law, but it also violates the Sharia itself. So, for example, one way that let me just explain one way in which the context of this law against insulting the Prophet, which is said to have derived from Islamic law, has been taken essentially out of its native soil and put into another context. First of all, that the law itself, Pakistan is a inherited, essentially a colonial British structure. I mean, it's made in the image of, it was created in the image of British a British colony, and this is obvious. And as I mentioned, the penal code was specifically intended to replace Islamic law. So merely by introducing as a positive law amendment into the penal code, something that is said to have actually originated from revelation, you're essentially questioning whether, or essentially setting up a situation which even makes the existence of this law something dependent on the will of the people, something that the Sharia actually does not acknowledge as a source of law, or at least as a primary source of law. The second thing is, I detail in my monograph on Section 295C, which is available out on the table out there, is that in reality, the Hanafi madhab, or the Hanafi school of thought, which Pakistan follows or purports to follow, actually does not mandate the death penalty for non-Muslims who insult the Prophet. But the fact that this law was introduced into Parliament by a military leader, passed by Parliament, upheld by this court, has obligated upon all future leaders of Pakistan to apply this law. And in reality, the Hanafi madhab says there is an opinion within the Hanafi madhab that does allow some sort of punishment for a non-Muslim who insults the Prophet, but doesn't mandate it. It's a pardonable offense. It is considered a crime, but it is a crime that is able to be overlooked by the ruler if the ruler considers that to be in the interest of harmony. So, in other words, the overarching goal of this of the Sharia itself is communal harmony and public benefit. When in fact the obvious case is that this is not to the benefit of the public. And then I would also mention the fact that there has been challenges to this law and challenges to its specific application. For example, most recently in the case of Asia Bibi, the Christian woman who was accused of insulting the Prophet, it seems very clear that these accusations are spurious. And when the governor of the Punjab sought a pardon for her, Salman Taseer, he was assassinated by his own bodyguard at the urging of local mullah, who invoked the challenge to the in essence manhood of Sunni Muslims, and also brought in the speech that he gave, which incited this murder. This mullah invoked things like the humiliation of Muslims and so on, which actually none of these are really related to the purpose of the Sharia at all. These are things that are essentially consequences of colonialism and after effects of colonialism, which itself is a facet of modernity. So now you have a law and a judicial system that is being driven by humiliation and other effects of modernity. And also I would mention that The law, the Islamic law under the Hanafi school allows the ruler, as I mentioned, to pardon or to not punish this at all. But in this case, who is the ruler? The ruler, when these fiqh texts were written, the ruler was considered to be one individual. He was the sultan or the emir or the khalifa. But in the case of Pakistan, the ruler is actually the parliament, the courts, and so on. So it's, and the parliament ultimately represents the people. For example, the Mufti of Pakistan, Mufti Taqi Uthmani, has defended this law, saying that, well, this is democracy and this is the will of the people. But there, this is not what it's supposed to be. First of all, the ruler is not the people, and according to the context in which these fiqh rules were written, and it's quite likely that those who wrote the texts that the Pakistani Federal Sharia Court and the Parliament relied on would not have written them in this way had they known the modern context that these things would have been written on. And I'll just close in saying that the people who wrote the texts that that the Parliament and so on relied on intended that peace and harmony and public benefit would result, because that's as Imam al-Ghazali, who's considered the doctor of essentially the master of the Sharia, of the Islamic law, said that the maslahah or public benefit is the underlying purpose, the main underlying purpose of the Sharia, and that is actually winding up to be the opposite in this case. This law is being used to drive communal warfare, really, and anarchy and disrespect for the law, which are all the opposites of what is intended. And as I'm sure will be discussed in this panel, these are some of I believe, and I contend, the inevitable results of attempting to isolate out of context fiqh rulings and introduce them as positive law in the modern nation state.
Well, thank you, Ismail. Let's go down with Sohaib Khan now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for showing up in impressive numbers. I wish we had this kind of attendance in our academic conferences as well. So I just want to begin by thanking Michael and Ismail for inviting me, and also expressing my sense of unease that stems from the very evident lack of women scholars on this panel, and I understand that my presence contributes to that exclusion, but
we invited three different women scholars.
Right. But I thought I should at least state the obvious. There's work done by extremely talented and influential women scholars, some of whom Ismail cites in his monograph, Asifa Qureshi, Navida Khan, Sadia Tour, just to mention a few. So do look them up. There's some interesting expertise out there. So I was asked to talk about theoretical and conceptual issues, and I hope I don't bore you a lot, because I think that any conversation that attends to religious freedom, religion, and law of the state, we need to understand how we are using these terms, not simply in a lexical sense, but I think what normally happens with religious freedom advocacy is that we assume that religious freedom is this universal value out there, and we here in the United States tend to be the purveyors of these universal moral values, which are gradually disseminated to the rest of the world. The way it turns out is that whenever you see an encounter of religion with the state, or state legal institutions defining religion, religion is not something that is discovered, but religion is something that is continuously reformulated through these state institutions. So religious freedom is not a universal value that is out there. It is context-bound, and it unfolds through different socio-political contexts. So I want to start with an example from home. The work of another woman scholar, Winifred Sullivan. She has a very interesting book called The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. And some of the insights in that book, they apply to Pakistan as well. So those of you who've read the First Amendment know that we have an establishment clause and a freedom of exercise clause. Now, oftentimes these two clauses conflict with each other. The Establishment Clause says that the state or Congress shall pass no law that supports a religious establishment. At the same time, Congress cannot interfere in the freedom of people to exercise their religious beliefs. So oftentimes, if there are situations, and Sullivan talks about this, where if Congress supports the right of a particular religious community to exercise their religious freedom, that could also be interpreted as supporting a religious establishment. And in order to determine what can be exempted as religious freedom and what can be prohibited as supporting a religious establishment, legal institutions have to determine what religion is. So in this process of determining the legality of certain practices, religion is continually redefined and rediscovered. So that is something that we should keep in mind. And another very good example, recently a book came out, it's called Consuming Religion by Catherine Lofton. And she makes this very interesting observation that when it comes to the freedom of exercise clause, at least in recent history, individuals have been unable to claim conscientious objection on grounds of their religious beliefs and values. On the other hand, corporations often invoke the religious freedom clause to defend their civil liberties. So for example, a famous case is the Hobby Lobby case, where this corporation did not want to, after the passing of the Affordable Care Act, they did not want to provide contraceptives to their female employees because they believed they had the corporation had a pro-life stance. And they were able to do this. They were able to claim their religious freedom. Whereas those of you, this is Washington, I'm sure everyone knows about Kim Davis, the lady who refused to issue that marriage certificate to the same-sex couple. She ended up in jail. Now, I'm not defending her. I think Kim should have done her job. But the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes religious freedom is afforded to certain bodies, corporate bodies, and sometimes it's not afforded to other bodies. And the case of Pakistan, as Ismail mentioned, is no different. Now I want to get into something that is slightly more theoretical, and I'm invoking the work of a famous scholar called Wael Hallaq, who has a book called The Impossible State. And there are some interesting observations in there which talk about the very anachronism of the idea of an Islamic state. So the basic premise is that the nation state as a legal body or national sovereignty, it is premised on a completely different worldview of politics, of law, compared to the kind of worldview in which the Sharia function. And I'm glad Ismail mentioned the colonial genealogy of Pakistan's blasphemy laws. The interesting thing is that when colonial administrators, British colonial administrators came to India, and when they reviewed Hanafi fiqh, they were troubled not by the law's rigidity or its barbaric nature. They were troubled by the fact that this is such a pluralistic system. And we have far more qualified scholars to talk about this over here. If you pick up any classical text of fiqh, which is jurisprudence, you will see an opinion by Abu Hanifa, which is then contradicted by Abu Yusuf, and then Shaybani says something else, and then the tradition decides which opinion. They're going to grade opinions in terms of their strength. So you don't have, no single legal stipulation enjoys this exclusive status. It is something that is negotiated through tradition. So colonial administrators found this very chaotic about the Sharia. This is directly opposed to the kind of image that the Sharia enjoys in contemporary media as this barbaric and non-negotiable legal system which descends directly from heaven and human beings have no say in it. It is actually an interpretive system. So while Hallaq tries to distinguish what he calls Islamic governance, if we can use that term, from state governance by saying the state, on the other hand, does not recognize any legal authority or cannot recognize any legal authority above itself. Whereas in the history of Islamic governance, in the history of Muslim empires, the ruler or the caliph, and I'm glad Ismail touched upon this, was always subservient to the Sharia. And the other interesting thing is, since Ismail mentioned the role of the ruler, the reservoir of religious authority in Islamic governance was never the caliph or the sultan. The law was always formulated by the community of interpreters, the community of believers. These were the four schools of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam, or the schools of jurisprudence in Shia Islam. They're not schools that were established by the state. They're not, these jurists, they're not state-sponsored lawyers who create the law. They are private citizens who are enmeshed in society, and they're responding to people's questions about religious practice, and they are formulating the law. So there's a difference. A scholar by the name of Talal Asad, he uses the term discursive tradition to describe what Islam is. A discursive tradition, it is discursive in the sense that it is argumentative, but it is a tradition in the sense that it has this continuity with the past. So this is how Islamic law develops. It's not created in a vacuum. It doesn't descend directly from heaven. There are communities of scholars who, through a long tradition of disagreement, keep formulating the law. Now, the idea of a discursive tradition directly contradicts the notion of codified law. After British colonialism, the experience in the Muslim world, especially in the case of nation states, is that you have state legislators that are going to define the law and that are going to codify it in the form of state law. And unlike the opinions that were issued by jurists, which were called fatwa, which are non-binding legal opinions, state law is binding. And a refusal to abide by state law could invoke punishments. So do we have 10 minutes or 15 minutes per speaker? 15 at the most. 15 at the most. Okay, all right. That's good. Okay, so I have a little more to cover. All right, so there's that. Now, I just want to briefly address the case of Pakistan, and my esteemed colleagues will shed more light on this. The work of Qasim Zaman. I can't help citing people. I mean, I'm used to academic conferences, so please bear with me. Qasim Zaman has done pioneering work on the relationship between ulama or the religious establishment and the Pakistani nation state. Now, these ulama are part of that discursive tradition. They're reading these old texts. They're reading Abu Hanifa and the opinions that were transmitted from him and were debated and subsequently became part of the tradition. At the same time, they have to deal with this monolithic state, which is not willing to accept any authority higher than itself. So Qasim Zaman mentions that the religious establishment or the class of ulama or scholars, they have this ambiguous relationship with the state. They understand that it is important to implement the Sharia, but now that they're living in the world of nation states, they know that this can only be practically or efficiently done through institutions of the state. So they have this sense of necessity of implementing the Sharia, but at the same time, they recognize that this draconian body known as the nation state could actually overtake the Sharia. So this is this kind of ambivalent attitude exists in Pakistan between the ulama and the state. Ismail also mentioned Pakistan's blasphemy laws, and I'll just end with this last point. Oftentimes, we also tend to think that the Sharia is this autonomous legal system which is different or in direct opposition with secular law. But the phenomena that we've observed historically in post-colonial Muslim nation states is that Sharia law and the law of the state, they are in dialogical interaction with each other. But obviously, the law of the state has this higher authority. There's this asymmetrical relationship, but they are both shaping each other. I think of the work of a famous scholar, Rand Herschel. He comes up with a term called constitutional theocracy. I don't think there are any theocracies existing in the world today, but he cites the cases of Muslim countries like Pakistan, Egypt. All these constitutions, they have these slight theological clauses somewhere in the constitution that sovereignty belongs to Almighty Allah and it is a trust that the people of Pakistan have to respect. And at the same time, you have these secular laws. So there's this creative tension in the constitutions of these countries. But what happens through this dialogical interaction is that the Sharia, when seen through the lens of state law or when codified, also gets redefined. So a good example is the penal code that Ismail cited. Another part of that penal code is 298B and C. Popular media projections of this law is that this is the law of the Sharia, this barbaric law which oppresses minorities. But actually, when this law gets enmeshed within state secular law, with secular power, it becomes even more draconian. The interesting part of this law is that Ahmadis, the Ahmadi minority community, is forbidden from calling themselves Muslims, from making the adhan or call to prayer, from identifying themselves with Muslim titles. Now, why is that? Because the idea, and the penal code invokes a notion of intellectual property rights. Now, this is something that is unprecedented in Islamic law. In fact, in classical Islamic law, there is the possibility in Hanafi fiqh of a non-Muslim making the call to prayer. But the state law, and I'm going to read it out to you, it forbids Ahmadis from doing this. Why? Because the adhan, or wearing a certain kind of dress, or having a mosque, or calling your place of worship a mosque, this is the intellectual property of Muslims proper. So you are more than welcome to exercise your religious freedom, which is also there in the Pakistani constitution. But you can't do it in the name of Islam, because that is a legally defined religious category. And I'm just going to read out that quote from you, and then I'll be done. It is thus clear that intentionally using trade names, trademarks, property marks, or descriptions of others in order to make believe others that they belong to the user thereof, it's confusing, amounts to an offense. And not only the perpetrator can be imprisoned and fined, but damages can be recovered and injunction to restrain him issued. Now, this is the more interesting part. This is true of goods even very small value. For example, the Coca-Cola company will not permit anyone to sell even a few ounces of his own product in bottles or other receptacles marked Coca-Cola. The principles involved are: do not deceive and do not violate the property rights of others. I can assure you that the classical jurists would have been flabbergasted after reading this opinion. So that is all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move down to Dr. Ali.
Morning. I apologize for being a little bit late. I just got in this morning and didn't realize it would take so long to get here from the airport. And then, in traffic, arrived at 7 and arrived at the airport and finally made it here. And I also would like to just ask for your forbearance with me in light of the fact that I haven't had much sleep last night, but I will attempt to offer a coherent presentation, and I'll try to build a little bit off of what my colleagues have already stated as well. I think it's probably a good thing to start with. There was, yesterday, someone sent me an article about an issue, a verdict which was just issued in the European Union, the European Court of Human Rights, regarding a case in Austria where a woman had been sued for blaspheming the Prophet Muhammad, accusing him of being a pedophile. And the court actually ruled against her, and she was given a particular a fine, and it reads that the Austrian court convicted her of disparaging religious doctrines in 2011 and fined her 480 euros, a judgment that was upheld on 2 appeals. Stating that the court had found that the applicant's statements had been likely to arouse justified indignation in Muslims and amounted to a generalization without factual basis. The Strasbourg-based ECTHR said that the woman's comments could not be covered by the freedom of expression. Now, what's interesting about this to me is that one of the things that I've been asked to talk about is a little bit to sort of contextualize the Islamic territories, I guess we can say, pre-modernity as opposed to post-modernity, in order to give us a better understanding of why certain laws exist, or this particular belief about the blasphemy law sort of actually exists. And the very fact that it mentioned this concern about society sort of becoming or conflict being the result of people being able to say certain things publicly, that to an extent this was somewhat one of the major concerns in the past. Now, statism definitely it is something that that has definitely made it difficult for Muslims in the times where we live to really cope with the transition from pre-modern statism as opposed to modern or postmodern statism, in that in many ways, when we look at the pre-modern state or pre-modern Muslim state in particular, what anyone who has any detailed knowledge of Islamic law would notice is that, as was already alluded to, that there was a celebration of a certain type of pluralism. That is to say that that Muslim jurists found it easy to accommodate other religious groups, especially groups like Christians and Jews, and also you find accommodations for Zoroastrians. For instance, in certain books of jurisprudence, you find it stated that that if a Zoroastrian was to come to Muslims to adjudicate an inheritance law issue, for instance, wherein the person who had passed away happened to be both the father and the husband of the survivor, right? Because in the Zoroastrian religion, what we considered to be sort of self-marriage or incest was lawful, that Muslims would adjudicate those issues, and if they were asked to do so. So they may say, okay, what shares should that particular woman receive in this particular case? And so the Muslims themselves, they, even though in Islam incest is considered to be unlawful and immoral, that they themselves acknowledged the fact that others had different moral systems, and so they were given a sort of type of self-governance, a self-rule. Now, one thing about Sharia I think we need to try our best to sort of clear up is that that there is an aspect of Sharia which is, we can look at and simply translate as the revealed law. The revealed law. There's certain things about Islam which are non-negotiable, and then there are other things which are open interpretation, which are negotiable. But Sharia is both the revealed law and the laws resulting from interpretative preference, which sort of happens as a result of the fact that certain verses of the Quran or certain hadith of the Prophet Muhammad are ambiguous in their indications, right? But the Prophet had brought, is looked upon as being the foundational teachings of the religion. His example is looked upon as the example that all are expected to follow. But the scholars themselves who interpreted those ambiguous verses of the Quran, for instance, they acknowledged that this particular endeavor was a speculative endeavor. As a matter of fact, they coined an adage, al-fiqhu min bab al-dhunun, or jurisprudence is from the realm of speculation, meaning that when a jurist offers an opinion about Islam or an interpretation of a verse or a hadith of the Prophet, that fundamentally that person is saying what he or she thinks God would say in this particular case. They didn't see themselves as legislators. They saw themselves as people clarifying what God had already decreed. And so their job was somewhat like just removing the veils of an eternal sort of law that already exists with God. And of course, they acknowledge as well that there may be disagreements about these views. And so the area of confusion largely happens in the latter area in the area what we call ijtihad, in that what has happened in the Muslim world and in the Muslim community overall is that even Muslims themselves at times are a bit confused about exactly what is considered to be negotiable and what's non-negotiable about the religion. Now, you add on top of this colonization, invasions, and all the things that we've seen in our own lives, some of those things, and the reaction to that sometimes people have the tendency to simply reject anything that they perceive of being foreign as well. And this is what makes the job of even attempting to change such a law very difficult, because Many of the scholars in Pakistan, I would imagine, and well, some people I even know, are very much resistant to the idea of changing the laws because of the sense or the suspicion that there is an attempt to control and to reform Islam from without. And so, and that in itself is not a very attractive idea for them. But Islam definitely has static elements to it, but there are also dynamic aspects of Islam, and as Sohaib had highlighted, that it's a discursive tradition. And so to give you an example of this, under the second caliph of Islam, Umar, for instance, there was a case of inheritance that was brought to him during his time, and it was an anomalous case that, the Muslims, when the Prophet was alive, they didn't have the answer to that particular puzzle. So he judged in one way regarding that particular case. The following year, a similar scenario had presented itself, and he judged differently about it. So when he was challenged, and it was stated to him, he said, well, last year you said this about this. So he responded, well, yeah, that's the way that we ruled last year, and this is the way we ruled this year. Because he didn't see the religion as something, a very static system, or even a system in the sense that we understand it today. And this is what makes it very challenging, is that the nation-state system seems to be that those who envision the success of the nation-state system see it as an attempt to equalize everything and everyone, and to sort of impose a type of uniform type of law code for, at least if you're in a certain state. We know that in the United States that not all of our laws are the same. Like, for instance, you can go to different states and find the age of marriage. It differs from state to state, right? Very young girls can get married in different states, and they can't in other states. They can't. You have to be at least 18, for instance. So you have, there's diversity even in our own country. But this is something that just needs to be understood, that this is at the root of some of the resistance, I guess you would say, to a lot of the changes that have been proposed. As when it comes to the issue of blasphemy law, to come back to make my final point, because I don't want to go on for too long. I know looked like we started a little bit late, but when we look at the idea of the blasphemy laws, about first the Muslims themselves not being allowed to even repent, for instance, according to this opinion, if they insult the Prophet, and then for non-Muslims also being subjected to execution as a result of that as well, even though that in itself is much more disagreement about the non-Muslim, or there's more reason to believe that there's a strong a basis to argue that non-Muslims should not be executed for that. And I would argue as well that Muslims, there's a strong argument to be made for Muslims not being executed either. And of course, Ismail's article helps to clarify that. I think it was very well written. But all of this is really an outgrowth, I would say, of interpretation of a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, wherein he said, "Man baddala deenuhu faqtuluh," kill whoever changes his deen. And the word deen is generally translated as religion. And so, but the thing about religion is that we understand it in this very limited way today, that it's really limited to theology, for instance, or your sort of what you think and following your conscience. It has nothing to do with politics. It doesn't have to do with culture. It's separated from those different things. But in the pre-modern world, and in particular in the Muslim context and the Arab context, that religion was inclusive of culture. It was inclusive of the political norms. It was inclusive of the norms in society that protected the groups from the threats, outside threats. So realistically, and this is one thing that even British scholar Karen Armstrong, that she highlights, is that pre-modern religions really, they were much more broad and inclusive of these different areas of of concern, and she actually goes on to say that the only religion today that truly qualifies as religion is Protestant Christianity because it does make this clear separation between the church and state, between the secular and the religious. Whereas other religions, quote unquote, pre-modern religions, they don't make that clear demarcation between the two. And so all these things are involved. So if anything, the prophet saying that was really saying whoever defects, whoever leaves, right, defects from our group to another, who are enemy faction, then it was like a sort of like a ruling of high treason, for instance. And so we get from that other rulings like, okay, scholars would say, okay, if you change your religion, then you should be killed. Then that means, for instance, if a person abandons their prayer, that in itself leads to a person being considered to be an unbeliever, and so that person should be killed for the abandonment of his or her prayer. And then going further, if a person insults the prophet, that in itself is a sign that one has rejected the message of God. So that person is also subject to being killed. And so basically, what I'm saying is that off of that single declaration and then this interpretation of it, that a lot of other rulings which are rooted in a certain type of rationale or a reasoning has resulted in us today, Muslims today, being confused about what actually is revealed law and what itself is a result of someone's interpretation. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Arlene, for someone who apparently didn't have much sleep last night. I thought that was a perfectly coherent speech, much better than I would have done with no sleep. So finally, let's hear from Sheikh Mohammed Amin Kolwadia.
Thank you. Good morning. It's been a wonderful experience sitting with these three people here today. I want to mention a few things. The first is a language issue, I think. Let's give you a sports analogy. I think we need to kind of be on a light side too. Trying to explain to somebody who understands and plays and loves baseball, trying to explain cricket to that person is almost an impossible task. They use the same language. They have a batsman, they have a pitcher, they use a ball, they even have a person behind catching, they have a catcher, they score runs, and they win and lose. Okay? But baseball is not cricket, and cricket definitely is not baseball. Okay? So if you understand what I'm saying, you understand that there are two languages going on here. We're using two very different standards of evaluation, two different theories, two different philosophies, many different paradigms, and even perhaps epistemology, and on top of that, two very different theologies. Okay? So I think the first thing we must appreciate is that if we start to discuss law in a universal sense, which is almost impossible, right, then I think we're going to be short-fused. Okay? I remember about 20 years back or something that there was this Mars orbiter which was blown up because the engineers used two different references and indexes. One group of engineers used the metric system, and the other group of engineers used the British system in order to calculate the position and the path of the orbiter. Right? So it exploded because people were using two different reference points and two different systems of analysis. So likewise, the idea that we want to explain Sharia to somebody who doesn't know Sharia is like explaining cricket in terms of baseball and baseball in terms of cricket. I don't think that's possible. Either you get to the field and you have the same rules of engagement and same terminology, or you have a much broader platform where you can accommodate both. And I think this is the issue in Pakistan. Okay? This is the issue in many Muslim countries. that, as Ismail mentioned, this is post-colonial language. The culprit, I think, being somebody like Hamilton. Hamilton translated a book of Hanafi law known as the Hidayah. In his translation, he leaves out the whole first volume of that book, which means that he simply did not understand, or if he understood, he left it out on purpose, that the word Sharia means something very different to a Muslim. In the word Sharia, we include religious law, such as the laws of ritual worship, the laws of fasting, the laws of ablution, the laws of the Hajj, the pilgrimage. That is part of Sharia. That is part of Sharia law. When we behave kindly to our parents and to our neighbors and to our relatives, that is Sharia law for a Muslim. For a Muslim, that is Sharia. So the idea that people want to abolish Sharia means you're asking Muslims to give up their civilities, to give up their civilization values. That's not going to happen. So I'm saying that if you confine the word Sharia and Sharia law to something that is almost Anglo-Indian, as Ismail pointed out, or in the case of Hamilton, he wanted to develop, which he did, this Anglo-Muhammadan law, then you're going to have many problems. And I think that's where we should start. I had a conversation with the late Cardinal George out in Chicago, the Archdiocese of Chicago. He and I went a long way. We discussed many things. One of the things we discussed was the use of language. So his conclusion was that if you use the language of the Bible and you kind of squeeze it into your modern state law language, then that's a disservice to the language of the Bible. That was his opinion. Okay? We, as Muslims, also feel the same way, that sometimes when the ulama of Pakistan or ulama of any other country are talking to the state legislators and the people who want to bring in or promote modernity, we're using two very different languages. One is the language of wahi or revelation, and whatever interpretation that we receive from the scholars of the past, even in the classical sense. So even in the classical sense, the scholars used a very uniform language, all four schools. Okay. Now there's some very minute differences and nuances, no doubt, but the language and the philosophy and the epistemology was the same. When you come into modern law, then the language and the epistemology is very different. And I think Pakistan is a good place, and perhaps Turkey and other places, and Iran's already done it in some way, where you can have a broader platform to include and incorporate both sets of languages and both sets of ideologies and philosophy. As to the issue of the role of ulama or scholars in Pakistan, I think there are several issues there. The first is that when it comes to dealing with politics, and especially the militants who are out there, okay, we have issues because they don't respect the fatwa, the verdicts that are given by their own people. Okay? So the Taliban basically are from the Deobandi school of thought. So the Deobandi people in Pakistan, they issued fatwas against the practices of the Taliban, which they rejected, and they had their own fatwas. Okay? So there's no authority there because the fatwa is non-binding. Because a fatwa or a religious opinion from a scholar is non-binding, they decided they're going to go independent or they wanted to go rogue, and they use their own terminology and their own justification, again, through the verses of the Quran and through the statements of the Prophet to justify what it is they're doing. That's a political issue, I think, and I think that my hope is that we try and remove the ulama and the madrasa from politics so that they can develop scholars who understand law and understand the issues that are at hand in Pakistan. This is the first thing. The second thing is, as what Qasim Zaman says, is that the tone that is used by both parties to each other is very derogative, is very derisive, and you can't get people to sit at the same table. There are two groups there in Pakistan, well, three groups, the Deobandis, the Barelwis, and you have the Ahl Hadith. Okay? So a friend of mine suggested that what we do is that we get all the Deobandis and Bareilwis in one room and ask them to sort out all the issues of the Muslim community and lock them up for a month or so. Let them discuss this. So I said, that won't work. So he said, why? I said, because one group will not pray behind the other group. At some point, they're going to pray 5 times a day. One of them won't offer their prayer behind the other group. So you have a problem there. Okay? So I'm saying is that trying to get people of different opinions, and the Deobandi Bareilwi legal philosophy is about the same. They're both Hanafis. They both share the same methodology, the same legal philosophy, the same legal principles, the same legal theory, but they won't sit together and discuss things for perhaps the betterment or the improvement of the Muslim community in Pakistan. So this is the second thing. The second thing is the tone that people use needs to be more civil, more polite, more understanding, more accommodating, and I think that's where I think the third point is that we need somebody or a group of people who can be a bridge between the scholars, the ulama, and the legal theorists of Pakistan, and the judges, that they can meet and discuss things from a very academic point of view, from a very academic platform, that this is our methodology, meaning the ulama will say their methodology is basically based on interpretation of wahi, and that's their methodology. Whereas the modernists, and especially the postmodernists, may say their methodology is utilitarian, or their methodology is pragmatism, or whatever. Okay? So that at a foundational level and a fundamental level, that really needs to be discussed so that we can build a cohesive community and work together towards improving the legal state. Fourthly, the issue as how much influence and power does the Sharia court have? Does it have in Pakistan? I mean, if somebody from the Sharia court, if the Sharia court decides a case, then is the higher court, meaning the Supreme Court, bound to follow the ruling of the Sharia court? It's a big question. Because at the moment, the higher court, the Supreme Court's verdict, is binding on all the other courts underneath it, which is what we call the issue of precedent. So in the issue of precedent in law, that the higher courts will rule and the lower courts will follow and abide. Likewise, we have precedents in legal theory, in our philosophy also, that our philosophy, basic legal philosophy, is based on the issue of precedent. So in the Hanafi school and in all other schools, the closer you are to the source, meaning Abu Hanifa, the more authentic your opinion will be. So that's how it's developed, and that's how it's based. But in Pakistan, it seems that this is called a precedent, but when you have the rule of precedent, then you're going to be initiating and institutionalizing what we call taqleed. Taqleed is to follow the opinion of someone else. So if you're binding the lower courts to hold on to the rulings of the higher courts, then you are saying that the lower courts need to practice taqleed in matters that have been decided by the higher court, which doesn't give you too much judicial independence, which is another issue. Now, that might be right, that might be wrong, I don't know, but I think this needs to be discussed. So I think these discussions need to happen at a more fundamental level, at a more legal level, more theoretic level, and for that, I believe that we should find a way to protect the schools of learning, especially the madrasa, from being involved with the political tensions of the country, because that just stifles their growth. The ulama who run the madrasa, they're caught up in this whirlwind tornado of political confusion, and most of their time is wasted trying to solve that problem. Now, I say, I have an institute too. I say that we should leave them to the ivory tower, leave them to be the scholars who can then develop themselves and become people who will learn both the legal system of Pakistan through the Supreme Court and also the Sharia system through the Sharia court, and find a place where we can develop these people and train them so that they can be the future leaders of the country. Now, this works, I think, very well in a theoretical sense. But as you know, things on the ground are very different. Okay? When you want to apply something that is in theory into reality, it takes, first of all, a lot of time, a lot of money, but also the dynamics change very easily, maybe even overnight. But I think this needs to be done so that we can go forward, hopefully with a similar project, if not the same project, that I'm proposing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was a really terrific set of presentations. I enjoyed listening. I'm still digesting. I definitely learned a lot, and I think many of us did as well. I think it's set the stage for what should be a very useful discussion with you all. I'm just going to put one question to all of you before we go to the broader group. It's sort of an obvious question, and I think it may pick up on what you closed on before, sir. Much of what you have all articulated is certainly, or not much, a fair amount of what you've articulated over the last hour is at odds with the views of many in Pakistan, including, in many cases, those that hold power. The issue of the blasphemy law, of course, and you've argued that the blasphemy law contradicts Sharia in many ways. This is not a conversation that one could have in public settings in Pakistan very easily. And as I think was alluded to, it's dangerous to publicly call for the blasphemy law to be amended, much less repealed. So, how do you, this conversation that you're having here, how do you take this to Pakistan? How do you take this message to a country that simply may not want to acknowledge it? And I think you had mentioned the idea of having people to serve as bridges who could try to moderate these differences. But if you could get into a bit more detail about how to do that. And taking the question more broadly, I think you all have very eloquently articulated a vision for a more nuanced and tolerant understanding of Islam and Islamic law. But forget about Pakistan. You look at the world today. We all know what's happening in this world, and intolerance is at tremendously high levels. I mean, how do you, if you could just, a few of you wanted to respond to how you see the broader world as it is when it comes to these issues of religious intolerance, and how you would suggest taking this message to the broader world. So whoever would like to respond to the question, please go ahead.
I would say that, for starters, the way that I see it, based upon my studies of Islam, is that Muslims, like members of other faith groups, Christians and others, since the founding of their particular religions, have been struggling with trying to find orthodoxy, a search for orthodoxy. In our particular context, so the Hadith of the Prophet, the campaign to collect the prophetic traditions, it started almost about a century after his death, for instance. And we see the development of many different schools of Islamic law, schools of theology, among other things, different sects of Islam. And the way that I see it is that each group is attempting to validate or to champion orthodoxy according to his own understanding, or to claim that they themselves sort of carry the mantle of orthodoxy. So that, I think, is the first point that needs to be highlighted. And that's a source of tension between the Muslim groups that exist today. On the question of how do we reach people? How do we build those bridges? That in itself is a difficult question. I think that that question we shouldn't focus only on religious intolerance, in my opinion, because I totally agree with the statement that we're living in a time where intolerance is at an all-time high. but I don't think that it's mainly, I'm not totally sure we can say that it's mainly or only religious people who are being intolerant. Like we're having a lot of secular intolerance, especially right now with the elections coming up. There's quite a bit, that one actually gets the feeling at times. I've never seen the country as polarized as it is today, myself personally, in my life. But you get the feeling at times that potentially they can turn like just sort of like civil war type of, that level of type of clash that could potentially happen. Religion definitely is a part of it, but I do think that in trying to create a lasting peace, there has to always be some goodwill. There has to be sacrifices involved. And you don't create a lasting peace by compelling people to say or to not say something or to do something or not do something. And it's a lot of it's about perception. And as long as certain people feel that you are attempting to, that you're attacking their sacred, their sanctities, right? And you're attempting to remove them and replace them with something different, then it's always going to be difficult, if not impossible, for you to really build that bridge that you're seeking to build.
Also, I wanted to point out that it's not a coincidence that there's been a rise in a sort of what I think all of here would agree is a misunderstanding of our religion, with the consequences of chaos and intolerance and that sort of thing that is attributed to the religion. There's no coincidence that there's been a rise of that that corresponds with a decline in Islamic scholarship, which is a function of the decline of Islamic civilization more generally. And that is due to internal and external causes. So, and they're interrelated. So, the replacement or the co-option of the ulama class in the late Ottoman Empire and in colonial states, as in Pakistan, with the supplanting of the scholarly class and the Islamic legal systems with colonial legal systems and so on, and the decline of the waqf system, which funded the development of scholarship. All of that has declined, and so there's been a vacuum that has been replaced with ignoramuses and megalomaniacs and so on, who have assumed the mantle of scholarship, when in reality, in the past, they would not have been. They would not have had the guts to do that. So I think that what needs to happen for sure is what Sheikh Amin is discussing, is a revival of the people who will have the authority and the ability and the creativity and the depth in order to address the problems of and unique problems of the modern age that the previous scholars didn't have.
I'm just going to briefly. The first thing is that the conversations are definitely happening in Pakistan. It would be a huge disservice to my courageous friends back in Pakistan if sitting in Washington I said, well, we are the only ones who are talking about these issues. There's an organization called Engage. They're working with ulama, and they are trying to make sure that these blasphemy laws go through judicial review. Of course, there's censorship, and these are not easy conversations to have. And the reason I started my presentation by talking about these issues at home is so that we understand why it's difficult to have these conversations here as well. In terms of taking this on a global scale, I actually don't have the solution, but I'm a real expert in criticizing existing solutions. So I wouldn't agree. So the one thing is that I totally agree with you that it's not as if religion is the only problem. There's intolerance on the other side. But the issue I have with framing this problem in terms of this side and that side, just a few days ago I was witnessing Ted Cruz in his debate says, left-wing mobs storming the Supreme Court, we have an issue in this country. It just becomes each side wants to catch on to its own traumatic edge and blame the other side. That just derails the conversation. That it's not just religion, it's there on the other side as well. I think we need to understand how these two things are enmeshed with each other, which is part of what you were saying. And the last thing I want to say is that in the US, I have experts sitting next to me who understand American Islam much better than me. But I would say that there is this tendency of thinking that if we revive the classical Sharia, or if we go back to some kind of pure understanding of orthodoxy, then that is going to be the solution. Actually, people use different terms to categorize individuals who are part of this thinking, like neo-traditionalists or whatever. I would say that that is pretty much part of the problem rather than part of the solution. They enact their own kinds of exclusions. It's not like you revive a puritanical form of Sharia. I don't even know whether it is revivable or not, but that would perhaps be, I would say that that is anachronistic to assume that that sort of revival is going to bring about a solution. What the solution is, I don't know, but we can have a conversation about it, of course.
Well, thank you. Well, now we'll go to all of you. I would ask that you wait until you're recognized, until you have a microphone in front of you before you pose your question, because we're live streaming this event. People will miss out who aren't in the room. Please identify yourself and please ask a question, and only one, and keep it brief so that we have a chance to get through to a number of people. So we'll start on this side of the room, right up here at the front. Yeah. Oh, we'll get to you.
Thank you all very much. My name is Amin, and just had a question. It seems to be like the consensus view among Islamicists, meaning those who are interested in Islam in an intellectual way, is that essentially when it comes to Islamic law as it pertains to application, Sheikh Amin made a great point about, obviously Islamic law includes all kinds of things, including how you treat your mom and how you deal with a thief, right? But on the issues that are salient when it comes to governance and law that applies to other people, it seems to be that the consensus view is it could be described by, let's say, someone in Saudi Arabia or in Pakistan who is okay with the status quo, that is just an attempt at, you could say, perpetually goal shifting or moving the goalposts, right? That the modern nation state is this unprecedented behemoth of a thing that has relegated Islamic law to being only appropriately engaged with as, you could say, intellectual archaeology, and not a reservoir of things that actually are applied in the real world. And the danger in this, I think, is that that could be weaponized to delegitimize the very good points that were made here, and it could be used by someone from an extremist group like Daesh, right? They could say, well, you say that Islamic law is this decentralized, lofty thing that no one can actually attain, so how could you possibly justify your statement that we are upon misguidance? And so my question would be, how would you respond to those who say that describing modernity and specifically the modern nation state as this inherently corruptive element that prohibits us from applying Islamic law in the real world, how would you address the charge that that's just merely intellectually moving the goalposts perpetually?
Okay.
Anyone want to take
Yeah.
that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, the Islamic jurisprudence, as mentioned by my colleague here sitting next to me, is very dynamic. And it's also very versatile. So the principles of jurisprudence, the usul, are so flexible and pliable that you could perhaps address almost any modern issue through those principles. Much akin to the US Constitution, that people who read the US Constitution, they may be literalists and they may be pragmatists or whatever. Likewise, in all the four schools of legal thought, there's enough flexibility within those principles that we could very easily come to terms with modern issues. So I don't think the reaching a conclusion through those principles is an issue. I don't think that's ever going to be an issue. And when you look at the books of fatwa, okay, why are books of fatwa always being written? In every age, in today's age, we're talking about in the 2000s, there are hundreds of books of fatwa that are all very different. What does it show you? This shows you the great diversity within the legal playing field of Islam. And all books of fatwa will have different opinions. So you must appreciate the pluralism that already exists in the legal system. Now, the problem is how do you introduce this into a political system of governance, which you're saying, right? That is a problem. How do you combine the two? So that conversation needs to be had, I think. And we're still having that conversation. Hopefully we'll get there.
Anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, I'm feeling that maybe you don't feel completely satisfied with that answer, because I think part of what you were asking was what appears to be an assumption that we are saying. Well, I'll just speak for myself. That in particular, I may be saying that modernity is just like some sort of evil thing that totally destroyed the Sharia, right? Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Sort of epistemological happening that prevents us from even being able to.
Right, yeah. Well, I wouldn't. That's not my contention. My contention is not is something that prevents us from engaging, but rather that my concern is that when we don't see that there is clearly a difference between pre-modern and the postmodern, right? In terms of culture, in terms of society, in terms of the way the governments operate, that we will constantly misapprehend the sort of the meanings, the purposes, the goals, the intentions of other peoples, right? You know, and that's not to be a relativist. It's just to understand that, and I think that this is at the root of, or sort of like this, the crisis, I should say, that amongst even a lot of Muslim scholars today, is that them struggling to make that shift. You know, that they're not understanding that a lot of the books that they're reading were written in a different time, right, in a different context, when the world was operating under the presumption of war, not under the presumption of peace, right? And so, and instead of understanding that and understanding that there have to be people who live today to actually reinterpret and reevaluate these things that are there, that they get stuck in that particular time, especially and actually what further reinforces it is that Muslim countries start to be colonized by the West, and they don't have the trust that Westerners actually really mean them well. Right?
Yeah.
Michael, thank you for getting a great esteemed group here. Puneet Ahluwalia, South Asia Minority Alliance and Voice of Karachi. Mm-hmm. Would you all panelists say that in case of Pakistan, the Islamic law is more of the ruling elites or the feudal system's brainchild, even though it gives an illusion of democracy and secularism in Pakistan? And you also know that Pakistan was formed by the minorities. So the question is that, is it the elite which is putting forward the Sharia or the Islamic law to control the minorities, control their vision or their vision of Pakistan and future of Pakistan? Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. I would be wary of simplifying or reducing Islamic law in Pakistan to a project of the elite. It certainly is a project of the elite, but as Ismail mentioned in his presentation, it has this elaborate colonial genealogy to it. And you're absolutely right about the minority question. Faisal Devji talks about it in his book, Muslim Zion, that the Shia minority, the Khojas and the Ismailis and the Ahmadis, who were at the forefront of the movement for Pakistan, they're the ones who eventually got excluded, because the Sharia that was enforced is a predominantly Sunni establishment Sharia, and then even there within Sunni groups, the Barelwis have often complained that Deobandis have received much of the state patronage. I would just say I wouldn't say it's an it's just an elite project. I would say it's a complex assemblage of multiple factors. But yes, I share your sentiment. That's what I'm saying.
Could I just add something to that? I'm sorry to keep. I don't want to talk too much, but I think that this is one of the points that really makes it difficult for again what I was talking about, how when you suspect that there's an attempt to sort of colonize or continue to control. So on one hand, I can see that and I sympathize that particular sentiment. On the other hand, I think what's also important for a lot of Muslims to understand is that the intercultural exchange is universal. It has always been the case, So it may look that way, Why not take on or appropriate someone else's idea? You see, if it is a good idea, that also is Islam as well. So instead of us constantly seeing it as, okay, well, it didn't originate with the Muslims, and it can't be good, right? So that is one of those issues too that we have to really come to terms with.
Go ahead, Arifa. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. My name is Arifa. I have been in the parliament for last 10 years in Pakistan. In the democratic government, I was an elected member of the parliament. I want to make few things clear. I think there was some wrong information. It was not Ziaul Haq who actually brought Islam forward. It was Bhutto who passed the bill of Ahmadis, and the liquor was abandoned in the country, and there were other rules because of the pressure of mullahs, not because of, to be honest, that he was very, very Islamic kind of a person, but there in parliaments, there are pressures that we work on. And it's a very moderate country. I want to bring it to everybody's notice. It is not at all the way it is portrayed. It's a very moderate country. I've lived there for 10 years in the parliament, and even this time in the parliament, not many clergies are there. They are not elected. People didn't elect. So another thing I want to make clear, that not a single person so far has been punished in blasphemy in Pakistan. Qadri was hanged, who killed Salman Taseer because of whatever the reason was. It was people were not educated who just took this point forward. It was not basically that the law or the court gave them punishment. So let's make it clear that we should not paint a country so bad, that because of the wars they went through. And I think the terrorism was basically more of a political issue than an Islamic issue, in at least Pakistan. I don't know about the rest of the world. I'm not very scholarly, but I know this much. We were very moderate, and we condemned it, and we took care of it. So basically, if it is taken care of, that means this was not encouraged by the people of Pakistan. So coming from a moderate country, this obviously gave me this idea to make these few things clear. And one thing I want to say, like, you are scholars, you know much better than I do, but I think the only way to connect, all religions have rigidities. It's not just Islam. If you read, all clergies have certain problems. I think it is the education. Like we have this madrasas, Jamia Ashrafia in the middle of Lahore. It is not creating any problem. It is just scholarly. So when it's not that you should split it into groups, it is just education, modern education. If it is given with the values of today's life, of being a good person, that makes you a good Muslim, good Christian, good Jew. This is what our mullahs are not emphasizing. And they are still fighting on, we are this and we are that, Sunni, Hanfi. I don't even know about it. See, I've lived there. I've born in a Muslim family. I don't even know what is exactly Sunni, Hanfi, Brelvi. I hear it and I get confused. I could still serve in the parliament for 10 years. And I think we need to change our mindsets completely, especially sitting at the religious platforms. If you'll keep talking about, and fighting for certain sects, I think this is not the answer. So please see how, and please reply that how do you see this view as from a moderate woman of a modern Muslim country? Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful intervention. Sohaib?
Yeah. Thank you for being here and for making those clarifications. It's important to have voices from Pakistan, of course. Um, um, Amen, Ameen to everything that you said. My only disagreement would be, I just think that this entire discourse of scapegoating mullahs as this cancer that is corrupting entire society, and of course the state is trying to ensure that there is peace, that I think we need to be a little more, I'm not saying this to you, I think I'm saying this to us as a panel, that, and I'm grateful to you for expressing your dissent and your concern. We need to be a little more introspective about that. I think it is this problematic discourse of reducing the problem or scapegoating one section of society and blaming them for everything has compelled us to come up with solutions that have only exacerbated the problem. So yes, I do agree that we need to support moderate voices amongst the ulama and in society, and we need to make sure that we interact with those on the fringes, and I can't speak as a policymaker, but that's the only point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
If it's okay with the panel, I'd like to propose that we take a few questions at once, and then that way we can maximize our time, and I promise to remind everyone of the questions, so long as I remember them. So we'll start right here, and then we'll go down two gentlemen on this side, and then we'll come back here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm still reeling from the Malaysian declaration that Arab Christians could not use the word Allah, even though it's integral to the language. We debrief a lot of the guys we capture in Afghanistan and Syria to understand their motivations, and almost without exception, some cleric signed off on that particular attack, that particular bombing, that particular suicide event, overwhelmingly. So that puts a lie to the supposition that there's no connection between Islam and terrorism. In fact, we've seen attacks that are postponed a week, waiting for the fatwa before it could go forward. Doesn't Islam have an obligation to crush these clerics, not next century, but tomorrow morning?
Yeah, we'll take a few questions. So if you could, and that'll give you all a chance to think how you might want to answer that, if you'd like to. A gentleman with a green tie.
Yeah.
This is Washington.
Hello, my name is Abi. I have a question. In South Asia, Nepal and Indian courts have taken an active approach in decriminalizing same-sex sexual relations. Pakistan still criminalizes same-sex sexual relations. There is a life imprisonment and 2 to 10 years of jail. So what are Pakistan's judiciary and Islamic law's views on this?
Okay, thanks. If you could pass it to the gentleman with the white shirt, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, you've mentioned, or it's been mentioned several times, that Sharia has developed over time. Now, the Sunni-Shia split happened very early in Islamic history, so can we really talk about one Sharia, or is there a Sunni Sharia, a Shia Sharia, a Wahhabi Sharia? And if so, are there contradictions between them, and how does this play out in Pakistan?
Okay, let's stop there. So the question about Sharia, the question about Islam's position on same-sex marriage, and then the question about Islam's obligation to crush the mullahs, which I believe was your words. Would anyone like to respond?
Yeah, I guess I'll be the daring person to start. Well, the issue of I think it's the way that the question is framed is very problematic, because fundamentally, and I'm talking about the question about whether or not Muslims or Islam has the obligation to crush the mullahs in situations like like Syria and other things like that. And that fundamentally, the question does is places a burden on an entire population of people. Almost maybe billions of people first and foremost, and then second of all, it ignores the very fact that a fatwa is a personal opinion of an individual who has no binding authority to implement it. And so if people themselves, a group of Muslims, decide that they want to listen to an individual, that doesn't mean that the Muslims overall are listening to that individual. So in the context of the way the Islamic law generally works is that, okay, well, the muftis were always independent members of the Muslim society, except until towards maybe the last few centuries of the Ottoman, towards the Ottoman Empire, somewhat. An office was established for the mufti, but prior to that, it was the mufti was independent, and then you had your judges, and your judges. The only difference between the judges and the muftis is that the judge could actually enforce his judgment. He can compel people to actually comply to the judgment. And then there's a concept called the siyasa sharia, which fundamentally is the governors themselves having the ability or the right to actually limit a certain amount of things, a certain number of things which are lawful in Islam, if he sees or they see that it actually could lead to something harmful. All right. So, for instance, example of that may be like maybe raising the minimum age of marriage for girls, for instance. Right. Islamically, that there's no minimum age explicitly mentioned in the text, but if there's a belief that there's some harm being brought about in society because of this, then the governors have that right. So I think that that it does an injustice to the community overall, the world community overall, and then also expects a little bit too much from the Muslims when the people who are most capable of crushing them are most of the time those who are actually there physically fighting them on the ground, fighting, and usually you're talking about the Western powers. So the Muslims, of course, are attempting to, for all intents and purposes, what I've seen is that Muslims have been very much involved with trying to deflect the misunderstandings that are being promoted by certain mullahs, if you want to call them that. And so to place the responsibility on us to do something that we really largely don't have the power to do, that in itself, I don't think that's really fair, personally.
Also, I wanted to mention that 2 points. One is that, for example, many of these people giving these fatwas or purporting to give these fatwas are not qualified to give these fatwas. So it's not that they definitely claim to be authentically deriving these commands, these fatwas from verses in the Quran, but anyone who has depth of understanding of the religion and examines these fatwas, for example, I was just reading something from Anwar al-Awdaqi, who I knew, by the way, giving a fatwa that it was permissible to steal from non-Muslims. And anyone who has the slightest basics in Islamic law can see that what he's doing is creating a collage, cutting and pasting from different sources and texts and creating some new thing that really no one would recognize when they looked at it. And he was not qualified to give fatwas. He didn't have the ijaza or the permission to give fatwas. He was just a person who had a degree in management and from a university in New Mexico, and he spoke Arabic, and he wore a turban, and he portrayed himself. And this is very similar to bin Laden, who had an engineering background, or Ayman Zawahiri, who has a doctor's background. So this is related to what I was talking about with the decline of the status of the decline in the ulama class, resulted in this vacuum that allowed these types of people to come forward, which is not to say that there isn't anyone who made some mistakes and who had these kind of qualifications. But generally, the Muslim scholars did and do warn people against these type of deviance. And another thing that I'll mention is that most of the terrorist attacks that we're talking about, who are most of the victims of these scholars and their followers, are Muslims. If you watch, I dare you to go watch these ISIS videos if you can stomach them. And most of the victims are not Westerners. Most of the victims are brown people, with beards, and these are people who are accused of being traitors to ISIS, and therefore declared to be disbelievers, and they're cutting their heads off. There's a video where ISIS goes into a former slaughterhouse and has about 20 Muslims, and has them trussed up like sheep, and hangs them on meat hooks and upside down and cuts their throat. And all the blood is pouring into the drains and stuff. And they've left one person alone, left him alone to watch all this. And they're filming him. They keep cutting back and forth to his face. This is a Muslim. So these people are being killed for fighting ISIS. So I think that, frankly, I understand it's a fair question, but I will say that not to acknowledge that and not to acknowledge the Muslims who are fighting these people is actually a disservice to the Muslims who are fighting this type of thing.
Okay. Well, this panel discussion was not about terrorism, but since you've raised the question, I think there's so much to unpack. There's so much political baggage in the way these questions are raised. When Donald Trump said, I think Islam hates us. So the question is, what is the referent for Islam? You said, doesn't Islam have the obligation? So, I mean, I have people sitting next to me who've spent their entire careers denouncing these things and educating Muslims that this particular version of Islam or this particular interpretation of scripture is abominable. It is wrong. It is, and there are other factors that lead people to come up with these interpretations. I'm not going to get into that. But this, yes, you have to recognize, and Ms. Arafai is sitting next to you. She will tell you the resources that Pakistan has spent, the amount of lives that have been unfortunately lost in the fight against terrorism. So this question that does Islam have the obligation, I would really like to know who Islam is, who this person called Islam is. And we also need to look at the facts that, who are the main victims of this kind of terrorism. And of course, they already are working against it. They're speaking out against it. They're educating individuals, and they're actually, they're physically fighting against it. So I think there's a lot to unpack in the question itself.
Okay, there's a question, woman on the back of the room, seated.
No, we did. I think we did. He wants his answer. Their the other questions.
Very true. Yes, same-sex marriage. Yeah, sorry.
Same-sex marriage. Do you want to go?
Relations.
Same-sex
relation. Yeah.
Well, in the United States, until recently, the view in many states was that same-sex sexual relations was a public harm. And so I think that if a society determines that this is such relations harm the family and harm, and there continue to be very significant contingent in the United States of people who believe that same-sex sexual relations is harmful. So whether that should be prescribed by law or not, I think that a society has the right to determine whether, for example, in the United States, you're not allowed to smoke marijuana or do peyote, which is a drug often used by some religious groups for religious reasons. And you're also not allowed to marry more than one wife, although many religions, including Islam and the Mormonism, permit. So I think societies have the right to determine whether something is harmful. Now, whether the punishment should be what you mentioned, that's a different thing. But I think not to recognize what your question is premised on, the idea that it's a recognized, self-evident fact that a human being has some sort of inherent right to have sex with someone of his own, of his or her own sex, and I don't think that is self-evidently a human right.
Yeah, but I think the larger issue is that we must recognize Pakistan's sovereign status of being able to exercise self-determination. So if the legal community of Pakistan decides that that is wrong, then we should acknowledge and appreciate their right to self-determination. And that's how all legal systems in the world work. Otherwise, you get into the theory of intervention. You don't want to do that.
I guess, can I add? I think the first part of your question was about what is Islam's position, right, on that. Is that was part of your question, right? Or you're only concerned about what's happening in Pakistan? judiciary and Islam, right? I mean, this classical Islamic position is pretty clear. But classical Islamic position is really against sodomy. It forbids sodomy and punishes for sodomy. And the issue of lesbian interaction, that in itself was considered to be a lesser sort of crime. So mainly the concern is with that. It's been with sodomy, and I would go a step further than just simply saying that that people decide that it's harmful. That is harmful. I think that that in itself is probably not the best way to actually argue the case. I would say that there is a way to actually establish objective harm. And I do think that medically, there are certain harms that do result from sodomy that are well documented. And so I do think that was part of the original argument too, not simply looking at the very fact that if people all became homosexuals, then the human race would no longer exist. So that's the classical position of Islam. So issue of homosexuality, as that in itself is a totally different topic altogether. But Islam is really more concerned with acts by people, and then also with what we call sort of cross-dressing and sort of taking on the roles of opposite genders and things like that. So,
If we can talk after this event, I can refer you to people who are actually working on these issues and who are doing advocacy work for LGBTQ rights in Pakistan. I'm not an expert on this, but at the same time, I don't want to take either the apologetic route where we compare this to the US. Well, women couldn't vote in the US until the 1920s, so your question was not about the US, your question is about Pakistan. At the same time, when we invoke the language of rights, the language of self-determination, and the language of science, this was partly the problem that we were discussing early on in terms of how the Sharia itself is reconstituted according to the language of rights. So I think for me, the more important concern is, of course, people can have different opinions on this, but the more important concern for me, as I see in this country, why is it that religiously conscientious individuals who hold a particular position on issues on homosexuality or who are pro-life, why is there so much xenophobia on that side? For me, that package, I'm not saying that this is something true all over the place, but for me, that package, this combination of supporting a particular variety of capitalism, free markets, having certain positions, being pro-life, being xenophobic, being homophobic, this package is something that really troubles me. There are conscientious Christians who might be pro-life, but at the same time, they're not xenophobic. So for me, the rise, as Michael mentioned early on, that there's a rise in intolerance, and there are these interesting variables that become part of a package. So I would be interested in tackling that and seeing why that is the problem, rather than thinking why people hold certain positions on sexual morality. So.
And for the record, I would respectfully disagree that there's anything bigoted or morally wrong with believing that it's sinful to commit sodomy, or that it's something that a society should not allow.
Did anyone else? There's the question about Sharia, about one Sharia. Does anyone want to weigh in on that briefly?
Can you repeat it? What was the question again? What was that?
Sunni and Shia.
Oh, they're different Sharias, right.
There are different theories of law. There are very different legal theories, different epistemologies, different theologies, two very different sects altogether. So, the Jafari school of thought, the most common Shia school of law, I mean, they have some similarities here and there. They do overlap with some issues with the Hanafi law, but they're independent. They're independent theories and legal philosophies. So they exist the way they do independently. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take another round of questions. Start in the back. The woman she just stood up. Yep. Thank you.
My name is.
Hold on. Wait till you have the mic. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Colette Chabot. I'm adjunct faculty at George Washington University, and I teach a small seminar on education in Islamic Asia. This question is really for Sheikh Amin, I think. We want to have this discussion between those of different points of view, but so many people in all the faiths come to it hoping to find certainty. hoping to find something that's going to tell them exactly how to live their lives. And they are using it to deal with the ambiguity that exists in life and that they're more aware of because of modern communication. How do you begin to have a dialogue with people who came to religion in order to find that certitude and that fixed idea so they can reduce this ambiguity and uncertainty in their lives?
Thanks. Are there any other questions that we could add to this mix before we answer that very good one? No others? Great. Okay.
Okay.
Would like to
Yeah.
respond.
Well, that's a very good question. I think most people come to religion because they want to be certain of how they worship, who they worship, and issues of salvation and all of that. But in Islam, we have certain ideas, ideals, and concepts that are immutable and that are based on certainty of evidence. And we have other practices in the code of behavior that are inconclusive. And for that, I don't think you're going to find certainty at that level. And I think that's a life experience. And I think life is not a straight line. I don't think life is going to be defined in squares per se. I think life needs to meander this way and that way. And I think that life experiencing of, using your best judgment along with some very sincere and cogent advice, I think that goes a long way to finding not certainty, but at least peace within yourself. And I think that's the goal that everybody should have, the finding some kind of inner peace. There's a spiritual dimension to religion outside of the secularism that we're discussing here. There is an inner peace that people are groping for, they're looking for. They don't want to be left on the streets of moral anarchy or theological anarchy. They do want some kind of understanding that this is the way God wants me to be. And I think that's the conversation we should have, and try and point out that you're looking for something that's going to make you feel that you're close to God. That's the point of religion. That'll be my answer. But it's a conversation, and we can start the conversation if you want. It may never finish, but that's just life. I don't think there's an academic solution to that. It's just life. Yeah.
We have one final question right at the front here. Sorry about that. Sorry, just wait till you have the mic. There you go.
Well, I'm Nilofer, and my research focuses on relationship between the state and society. So state normally means status quo, and society means the social forces which are unfolding within that area. Time and space, of course, matters. And since it deals with Pakistan, my focus is on post-colonial state of Pakistan. I do deal with colonial era just as a reference as to how we have been hindered by that kind of an experience. Now, there are some explanations, and my final question would be a rather big one, as Madam Arifa described. Now, how does Islam work? I mean, obviously, Shoaib has already mentioned what is this Islam. What I'm trying to say is that Pakistan was one country which was created on the basis of religion. However, the country was created for the Muslims of subcontinent. And so that specific distinction has to be made between a state comprised of Muslims and to be created in the name of Islam. It wasn't created, it wasn't supposed to be an Islamic state. It was state for, considered to be the underdogs, Muslims, after the British colonialism, because the Muslim rulers were overthrown, and so Muslims were more or less underdogs during the colonial period. So it was a state created for the Muslims, and that is what Quaid-e-Azam declared. However, after Liaquat Ali Khan, the second prime minister, the third prime minister, Nazumuddin, who's called as Maulvi Nazumuddin, he made a basic principles committee in order to make the constitution, and that committee created a board of ulamas. And that board of ulamas wanted Islam, Pakistan was made in. So now, since 1956 onward, we do have this, and we cannot deal with it. It has to be the word Islam. The head of the state has to be a Muslim. So there it goes as far as whether Pakistan is the Islamic state or a state for Muslims. I personally feel, and research says, it was a state for Muslims. And so it was appropriated, as Ismail says, that that word or the idea of Muslims was appropriated later by the Islamic parties who were not a part of the movement for Pakistan. They had disowned the creation of Pakistan as a state. It was ummah, according to Islam, supposed to be an ummah and not a small state. So later on, they appropriated the idea, and that, I think, was for political power. It wasn't so much for the religion or Islam. It was for political power, which we do see after that. And then the Ahmadis were, and later on, Salman Taseers, and then Ziaul Haq. Now, here again, I do want to make, and I think it was not referred here except for Ziaul Haq, who is an army general, and he could do it. He didn't have to have a mandate of the people. It may have been rejected if it was a democratic power. However, on the other hand, the army general Ayub created family laws. Now, there are 4 marriages, according to Sharia, that we can. However, Ayub Khan created this family law, which meant that you had to have the assent of the first wife, which really made a difference to the woman gender issue. So that there it goes, that army status can be both positive and negative, because that relationship of the army and the civil forces is still going on. Now,
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think you could try to wrap it up?
yes, I will.
Yeah.
I will. Now, finally, I'm coming to crush the mullahs. No, one more thing, as Sheikh Muhammad said, that we need to have an academic research in Islam. Now, there is the Islamic Committee, which vets the law. And the head of that committee is Dr. Ayaz Qibla Ayaz, who is the former vice chancellor and the head of director of religious studies. So the state of Pakistan is trying to make it research-oriented. However, I'm not sure about the role of Taliban and ISIS as the representatives of Islam, because the first Sharia court was in my province, Northwest Frontier Province, and it was in the area of Dir and Swat, which is right next to Afghanistan. And right in 1990s, after the Russians were chucked out to Pakistan and the Taliban's, Mullah Fazlullah wanted to have Sharia courts. Now, these Swat are PATA, provincially administered. It doesn't have to do anything with legislature, provincial. So the governor of KPK, because the turmoil was too much, accepted the Sharia law and made Sharia courts in the Swat. However, what happened later on, that the punishments were so severe that Malala belongs to that area, Malala, the education and the gender, both, women's studies. Army had to come in and clean up. So I'm just sorry that the gentleman who asked, are we crushing? We are not actually crushing. We are trying to bring in the democratic essence of our society and bringing in the right kind of religion. I think ISIS and Taliban, I'm not sure, Sheikh Amin or of the panelists. My final question.
Yeah, and we need to wrap it up. This is good context, but we're running out of time.
How do we leave this panel and this seminar? Is Pakistan an extremist Islamic state, or is Pakistan fighting that kind of a demon, and it's a modern, liberal, gender, positive, friendly state? That's a very big question I'd like to have an answer to.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if anyone that would like to respond briefly to that, it's actually a very good question. So, go ahead.
It is.
Thank you, Dr. Neelo, for everything that you said. This is why we need to have women scholars on panels like this. So thank you for that history recap. I don't have an answer to this question. I'm troubled by questions like this. Is it a liberal, secular state, or is it an extremist state? But what I do want to say is the history that you narrated, that is one narrative amongst a set of competing and contested narratives about the foundation of Pakistan, the difference between the Islamic state versus the Muslim state. So we have to be open about these things. Hamza Alawi's entire thesis about this. Recently, Venkat Dholepala came out with a book called Creating a New Medina, in which he presents an alternative history. Now, of course, there is the nationalist history, right? My own thinking about these issues is that I am always suspicious about the nation state's autobiography, the way the state tells its own history. I'm not saying that you are partaking in that project, but I'm just saying that this is one narrative amongst a set of other competing narratives, and it has an end goal. It has a certain aspiration for Pakistan, and there are other competing aspirations for Pakistan as well. But yes, I do want to say in the end that I want to live in the same world as you do. So we might disagree about history, but we want to live in the same peaceful, tolerant universe. So that is where I wholeheartedly agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's an extremist country or fighting extremism, but I think in the interest of lunch, Pakistan has the best food on the planet.
I mean, theoretically, that would make a great final note, but does anyone else want to weigh in before we adjourn?
Well, one thing I just want to say that I really appreciate your comments and yours as well, and I think what's unique about this panel, and I thank the Wilson Center for hosting it, is that you have up here 4 people who are coming from the point of view of being people who care about the religion and who want to see something better for it, coming from the perspective of that Islamic law and has something to offer and has a role in this world, and that there are Muslims who care about it, and we have to be able to have conversations, civil conversations, with those who see things differently. Otherwise, we'll just be stuck in the same feedback loop of conflict. So, thank you.
Well, this has been a really rich conversation. It's really been tremendous, and we've covered some very difficult and very sensitive topics. And I'm very grateful to the speakers and for our audience for engaging them in a very respectful way, which I think is so important, particularly in this day and age when civility seems to have disappeared entirely. So, if you could join me in a round of applause for our 4 panelists. And thank you again as well to our co-sponsor, to the Religious Freedom Institute, particularly Ismail and Jeremy, who I'm sure is in here somewhere. Thank you all for coming as well, and we're adjourned. Have a good weekend.